Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to read Chapter 10, Immigrants Speak. Back in 1608, not long after the first settlers arrived in Jamestown, John Smith wrote to his bosses in the London Company and told them the kind of settlers to send to America. When you send again, I entreat you rather send but 30 carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, blacksmiths, masons, and diggers up of trees, roots, well provided, than 1,000 of such as we have. For except we will be able to both lodge them and feed them, the most will consume with want of necessaries before they can be made good for anything. During the 19th century, the kind of people John Smith wanted, working people who could build and farm and invent, came to America in ship after ship, and just in time. With all the new technology, there was plenty for them to do. They were needed to work in the new factories, to settle new land, to invent things. Immigrants did all that. Germans made up the largest single group of 19th century immigrants. Karl Schurz, was one of them, and he went with remarkable speed from immigrant to national leader. Here are Schurtz's own words telling his story. It is one of the earliest recollections of my boyhood. One of our neighboring families was moving far away across the great water, and it was said that they would never again return, and I saw silent tears trickling down weather-beaten cheeks, and the hands of rough peasants firmly pressing each other, and some of the men and women hardly able to speak when they nodded to one another a last farewell. At last a train started into motion. They gave 3 cheers for America, and then in the first gray dawn of the morning I saw them wending their way over the hill until they disappeared in a shadow of the forest, and I heard many a man say how happy he would be if he could go with them to that great and free country where a man could be himself. Carl continued, that was the first time that I heard of America, and my childish imagination took possession of a land covered partly with majestic trees, partly with flowery prairies, immeasurable to the eye, and intersected with large rivers and broad lakes, a land where everybody could do what he thought best and where nobody needed be poor because everybody was free. Skirts fought in a freedom movement in Germany in 1848, but when freedom fighters lost, he was in trouble and he had to flee to Switzerland. Then, being uncommonly brave, he went back into Germany to help his college professor escape from jail. But he knew if he stayed in Germany, he too would be jailed. Schurz was 23 and he set out for the land of freedom. When Skirts arrived in America before the Civil War, he found that some people weren't free. He wasn't the kind of person who kept quiet about something he thought was wrong. After all, he'd been a freedom fighter. He hated slavery, and he spoke out and said so. He reminded people that there was no freedom of speech in slave states. Without free speech, said Skirts, no one is free, neither slave nor master. In his new country, Karl Schurz found the opportunity he had dreamed of in Europe. He studied law, moved to Missouri, and became active in politics. Just 10 years after he arrived in the United States, President Abraham Lincoln named him American Minister to Spain. But he soon came home to serve as general in the Union Army. He became a newspaper correspondent, an editor, a United States Senator from Missouri, and a Secretary of the Interior. He was a public official who talked of conservation of the wilderness and fairness to Indians when hardly anyone else thought of those things. Like many other immigrants, Carl Schurz had fallen in love with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the guarantees of the Constitution. Next to the Germans, the Irish were the largest immigrant group. Before the Civil War, 1/4 of the whole population of Ireland came to America. That was 1.7 million Irish men, women, and children. They kept coming during and after the war. The Irish were desperate because in Ireland crops had failed, especially the potato crop. There was a famine. More than one people died of starvation in Ireland. The Irish spoke an ancient language called Gaelic. Although most were bilingual, they could speak English too. Many other immigrants didn't know a word of English, but America's free public schools, which developed in the 19th century, soon taught their children to speak the language. People were coming from countries that had not sent many people to America before, countries such as Russia, Italy, Poland, Denmark, Sweden, and Hungary. The population of Europe doubled between 1750 and 1850. All of those extra people needed food, homes, and jobs, and there just didn't seem to be enough of, of them in Europe. Many Europeans came to America to find work and to avoid hunger. Others came for religious freedom. Religious dissenters came from Holland, and Jews who were persecuted for their beliefs came from Germany, Poland, and Russia. Still, others came to escape political wars that were leaving parts of Europe in turmoil. Here is a picture of young immigrant boys who worked during the day, attended evening class for all nationalities at the Washington School in Boston, Massachusetts. And if we scroll down here, and down below we see this chart, immigration to the United States, 1860 and 1910, so 50 years apart. We see most of the immigrants in 1860 coming from North and Western Europe, and we see that kind of changing, shifting, and less coming from Europe. In the half century after the Civil War, some 26 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Think about that. 26 million is a whole lot of people. Many of the newcomers began life in the cities, in overcrowded apartments called tenements. Sometimes 8 families shared one bathroom. City codes make it illegal today. Mary in the Promised Land. Mary Antin was born in 1881 in a region of Russia called the Pale of Settlement. Most Russian Jews were forced to live there. They could not hold public office or open businesses, and they were taxed more heavily than Christians. Mary had a good mind, and she loved to read, but the schools in Russia were closed to most Jews. When her father got sick and then her mother, the family became very poor and had hardly enough to eat. Between 1860 and 1890, some 10 million Europeans came to the United States. Mary's family made the journey. None of them had ever seen the ocean or beyond the Pale or heard English spoken. It was a difficult journey on a crowded ship. Later, Mary wrote about her early experiences in America. She recalled walking along a city street that first night. So many lamps, and they burned until the morning, my father said. And so people did not need to carry lanterns. In America, then everything was free. As we had heard in Russia, light was free. The streets were as bright as a synagogue on a holy day. Education was free. That subject my father had written about repeatedly as compromising his chief hope for his children. The essence of American opportunity, the treasure that no thief could touch, not even misfortune or poverty. It was one thing that he was able to promise us, surer, safer than bread or shelter. On our second day, I was thrilled with the realization of what this freedom of education meant. A little girl from across the alley came and offered to conduct us to school. My father was out, but we five between us had a few words of English by this time. We knew the word school. We understood this child who had never seen us until yesterday, who could not pronounce our names, who was much better dressed than we, was able to offer us the freedom of schools in Boston. The doors stood open for every one of us. Mary Anton became the best student in her elementary school. When she grew up, she wrote her autobiography and called it The Promised Land. In it, she wrote of her adopted nation's priceless heritage, the freedom and opportunity that even the poorest immigrant like herself became rich in learning. Imagine that you are a 19th century immigrant. Maybe some of your ancestors were. You don't know the English language, and everything in the land seems different and strange. At school, almost everyone speaks English. How do you like it here? Most of the immigrants knew very little about America, except for it was a land of freedom. But that's what they wanted, freedom and a chance to work. They came in steamships. If they were poor, they were crowded into below deck areas called the hold or the steerage. It wasn't pleasant down there, but the trip cost $30 and now took just 10 days. Most of the immigrants came into New York Harbor to a place called Castle Garden, and after 1892 to Ellis Island, where the early Dutch settlers had picnicked. There they were checked before they could enter the United States if they had a disease or if the papers they brought from their former country were not right, they might be sent back to where they came from. So they were frightened when they arrived. Bianca de Carlis sailed from Italy. Conditions for poor people in Italy were awful, especially on the island of Sicily. Bianca wrote about how she felt when she arrived on Ellis Island. 1,000 times during the last day or two, I put my hands on my passport and papers, which I kept wrapped in a handkerchief under the front of my dress. This was just to make sure that they were still there. One of my companions said, Signora, you are very foolish. When you keep your hands inside your dress, you are telling everyone that your papers and money are there. Maybe a bad person will see. Take your hands away. Now, years later, I know I was foolish and silly, but we heard so many stories about others who were turned back because their papers were not in order. Jacob Riis was a boy who sailed from Denmark. He had read books about America and he had thought he knew something about the country. When he had read in Denmark were cowboy books. He expected to find buffaloes and cowboys in New York. Later, he said he was surprised to find New York paved and lighted with electric lights and quite as civilized as Copenhagen. Rees was very poor for his first 7 years in America. Then he got a job as a newspaper reporter and wrote about the difficulties of life for the poor in American cities. He learned photography. Most photographers took pictures of beautiful scenery or prosperous people. No one is taking pictures of the poor. Rees did. He showed exactly how some people had lived. His book helped get laws passed and made things better. Jacob Riis and Carl Schurz were reformers, and they knew each other. Some Americans had been in this country for a long time, had forgotten the nation's founding ideals. But the immigrants had came here to find freedom and opportunity in a land that said all men are created equal. They cherished American ideals. Equality of rights is the great moral element of a true democracy, wrote Carl Schurz, who understood exactly what that means. Do you? Here's a photo. Jacob Riis, an immigrant from Denmark, became a New York reporter who used photography to promote reform. by exposing the miserable conditions endured by the city poor. This photo was taken from 1901, showing children